Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening at the Mark Twain Library for another installment of our Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy series, presented by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library. My name is Erin Dumeier, and I'm the director of Mark Twain Library. In a moment, I'm going to let tonight's moderator introduce our guest speaker. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this award-winning conversation series, and also a bit about how to participate in tonight's program. Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy is a series of lectures and events created by the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters. Winner of the 2022 Connecticut Library Association's Award for Excellence in Public Library Service, this series began in the fall of 2019 to continue the community conversation on issues of race, justice, and democracy. Just a quick thank you to area libraries and leagues for their support of this series: Easton Public Library, Weston Public Library, Friends of the Weston Public Library, Newtown's C.H. Booth Library, Richfield Library, the League of Women Voters of Weston, the League of Women Voters of Richfield, and the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County. We are recording tonight's program, so the recording will be available to view next week on the library's YouTube channel, in case you'd like to rewatch or you know someone else who'd like to tune in. We've set aside time for questions at the end of the program, and you are welcome to submit your questions in the Q&A function at any time. We will try to get to as many as possible. We're also offering closed captioning. The buttons for both the Q&A and closed caption functions are located at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our host for tonight's program and moderator. Dr. Daniel W. Barrett is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Western Connecticut State University, and he's also a member of our Conversations Committee. A resident of Reading, he graduated with a BA from Wesleyan University, earned his PhD in social psychology from Arizona State University, and served as a postdoctoral research fellow in health communication at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Dr. Barrett.
And thank you, Erin. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another event in our series of discussions on truth, myth, and democracy. So I want to also thank the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters, of which I'm a proud board member, for organizing tonight's event. Tonight, I'm happy to be speaking with Dr. Jeff Miller. Jeff is the author of a recently published book called Democracy in Crisis: Lessons from Ancient Athens, and we'll be focusing on that book primarily tonight in our conversation. Jeff is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at SUNY New Paltz. He received his BA from the University of California at Santa Cruz and his MA and PhD at University of Virginia. Jeff writes and publishes mostly on political thought among the ancient Greeks, with a particular recent emphasis on democracy and theater, drama, which I want to ask you about later on if there's time, especially comedy. Jeff's work has been published in a variety of leading journals, including Political Theory, the Journal of Politics, and History of Political Thought. Jeff lives in Rosendale, New York, with his partner Sarah and their daughter Cleo. So Jeff, thanks for taking the time at this busy time of the semester to speak with us tonight. I'm not sure what your schedule is like at New Paltz, but this is our last week of classes and finals is next week. And so grading is just packing up or stacking up all around me right now.
I consider this a break from grading, actually. It's very nice to be able to do this. If you could pan out over the rest of my office, you'd see piles of papers.
So the title of the book, again, Democracy in Crisis, makes it obvious why this is an appropriate topic for our conversations on truth and democracy. I've conducted a number of these conversations over the past couple of years with some pretty serious thinkers, and I do admit that I found this one to be particularly challenging. Not because there isn't enough to talk about, but because there's too much to talk about, and I have too many questions, and there's just such a rich body of work in this book that you've written. I thoroughly enjoy reading a book and recommend it highly to anybody interested in ancient Greek political thought, in democratic theory, political thought, generally speaking, as well as the pitfalls and possible solutions to problems that we're facing here in America at this time. My knowledge of the workings of the classical Athenian democratic political system, was spotty at best, but now it's grown exponentially as a result of reading your book, Jeff. So thanks for that. I have a series of questions for you, get us going, and we'll probably go till about 8:30 or so, which time I'll turn over to audience questions and pass this on to you, and then we'll wrap up around 9 o'clock, as Aaron had mentioned. So, first question, Jeff. Can you begin by telling us a little bit about how you came to write this book? I understand a conversation with our very own Sarah Billick had an influence on you, in this process. And for those who aren't aware, Sarah Billick, along with Mary Ann Carmen, are the two folks who are most responsible for this conversation series, and we owe a great debt of gratitude to both of them. So, Jeff, take it away.
Well, I was at a party in Kingston. This was before COVID, so a couple of years ago. And as one does at the party, I was chatting about Athenian democracy and talking about it and holding forth. And after the party, Sarah Billick comes up to me and says, "I have a pitch for you. You should write a book about this." And I have to confess, the idea had not really occurred to me to write this kind of book, right, on this particular subject. But Sarah made a very, very persuasive case to me that there might be an audience for this. And I had thought of it sort of as cocktail party chatter, stuff that I would talk about with my students or a little bit. But then the more that I thought about it, the more I became convinced that there was something really to be said there. So I guess, hat tip to Sarah for pointing me in the right direction. And in fact, when I came up with the prospectus and sent it around to a couple of publishers, there was actually a lot of interest in it, which was also a little bit surprising to me. I think it's an odd thing. We have lots and lots of books about democracy, lots of books about American politics, lots of books about how to fix American politics. And the big gap here is people talking about, one of the rare moments when a very radical form of democracy not only existed, but thrived for roughly 2 centuries. People will talk, the founders, go back to the Roman Republic. Maybe historical knowledge in the United States goes back just a little bit, 100 years, 150 years, but nobody seems to avail them of this, what I think is a rich series of inspirations about how democracy can be very different from the way that we conceive of it today. So I guess that's the thing that really got me thinking about this was Sarah's comment that people really need to hear something like this, right? And I view the book as very much along those lines. I kind of want to expand the boundaries of how we can think about democracy, our thought about it, our understandings of the limits, what it can and can't do, how it should and should not function, seem to me to have become very sclerotic, where there's this whole long history. And I shouldn't restrict it just to Athens, but it pops up in several other places historically as well, but primarily in Athens, where they did things very differently. And so the book is sort of a way of kind of maybe thinking around some of the problems that we have today and suggesting pathways or possible solutions for problems that we face today.
Great. So I want to talk about Athens in a little bit, but before we get there, I want to talk about the theoretical foundations for your book, kind of some of the ideas behind it, the conceptions of some definitions of the terms, and also just about democracy in the U.S. right now. So there's a lot of discussion these days in various places about whether we actually have a democracy. What does democracy mean? Do we have one at the federal level, state level, local level, and so on? And can you define for us what democracy means to you? And does the structure of our government as dictated by our Constitution actually affect a democracy?
Well, I can put my Greek hat on for a moment, because I know if there was a citizen from the 5th or 4th centuries BC Athens here today, they would say, definitively that we do not have a democracy. And I could talk a little bit about why they might think that in a minute. But, from my viewpoint, democracy is a term, right? And it's a term that we can use in different ways. We have lots of countries claiming to be democracies today that don't really seem like democracies. I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about other, states that we might view as more authoritarian, sometimes claim this mantle of democracy. So this is a term that has contemporary currency. And so to a certain extent, you can fill that space up with whatever you want to. If you go back to the etymology of the term, of course, I'm sure your audience knows, right? The two Greek words that make up the term, demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power, right? It means people power. I should note note there, just, for the Grecophiles, for the Hellenophiles in the room, right? Kratos is a particularly brutal and tough form of power. There are sort of more liquid or pleasant forms of power, but Kratos is really the fist. So people power. How do you place primary authority in the people? So this raises lots of questions. What group constitutes the people, right? What constitutes the sort of power or authority you want to invest in them? But generally speaking, the term refers to the fact, at least in theory, that power flows upwards or is held by a large body of the population, maybe the citizens, maybe the entire population, maybe a subset of the citizens, depending on when you're looking at it historically. Now, for the Greeks, this meant very specifically that primary authority was in the hands of each individual citizen. And that primary authority was exercised not to generate representatives to carry out the task of government, but to actually do the day-to-day business of governing the state, and not only governing the state, but implementing whatever sort of policies that they passed. So it's lodged in the individual citizen. Now, the Greeks had a much more restricted idea of what citizenship meant, and we can talk about that if you want to. But the primary idea is they act, they don't have representatives. In fact, one of the really easy metrics that you can turn to think about it from a Greek perspective is elections. We think today commonly, right, that the most characteristic aspect of democracy, or at least one of the most characteristic aspects of democracy, are elections. We go to the polling places and we elect representatives who then go to Congress or to whatever assembly there is, the parliament. And then they take care of the policy making. Maybe you have a bureaucracy to do the public policy implementation and things like that. Now, for the Greeks, right off the bat, they would have viewed this, the use of elections, as an indication that we're in an oligarchy, not in a democracy. Ancient Athens for 200 years was very abstemious in its use of elections. In fact, generally speaking, they only had elections for 2 different offices, and they're not super important offices, right, in terms of policy making and lawmaking in the city. We can talk about that in a minute. And the reasons for this are obvious. For the Greeks, they would just ask you the question, who wins elections? Well, the wealthy, the powerful, the well-connected, the famous in the case of our former president, right? It's not the average person that wins the election. So elections are skewed towards the few, towards the wealthy, towards the powerful. So Greek democracies, Athens in particular, but Greek democracies in the classical period tended to think of elections as a sign that you're in an oligarchy. Aristotle comes out and says this right off the bat when he's kind of listing off characteristics of oligarchies. The first one, elections, right? Because they tend to restrict who can hold power. I think the Greeks are onto something there. Our elections do not yield only the wealthy and the powerful, especially at the lower levels, but at the upper levels, they do, right? You can look at the membership of the Senate or the House of Representatives, on average, much wealthier, on average, much whiter, on average, much more male, right, than the general population. So you have this skewing there. But the question, do I think we have a democracy or not? We have elements a functional democracy. We have aspects of it. Do we have a robust democracy? No. And do we have a democracy that's in crisis, as the title of my book implies? I would say yes. I don't know. Where do you want to take this conversation from there?
No, that's good. That's a good start. So we know that some of our founding fathers read the ancient Greeks. They read Aristotle, they read Plato, and they were concerned about democracy themselves for some reasons that were not unrelated to why the Athenians were concerned about direct democracy. And so they created a structure of our government to prevent just a general direct democracy of our president, for example. So we had the Electoral College, we had the 3 branches of government, as a sort of a stopgap measure, way to prevent, just mob rule essentially. So they did read at least some of the Greeks they could get to at a time, and were concerned about those issues that the Greeks were also concerned about, and made sure we didn't have a democracy to some extent, so representative rather than being a direct democracy.
Right. Yeah, I guess that would be the distinction, if you wanted to make one, representative democracy as opposed to a direct democracy. When the founders, looked to texts for inspiration, right, they'd look to the Roman Republic, right, which is a system of government in which power is graded, right? And there are lots of checks and balances in there, and the people don't have a lot of direct authority. Athens was, for them, sort of a cautionary tale. And there's a long history of this, and it goes all the way back to the Athenians themselves. One of the really interesting things about the authors that you would associate with the classical period, and for those of you who don't know, when I talk about the classical period, I'm talking about roughly the period from the beginning of the 5th century down to the end of the 4th century, so roughly 200 years BCE, right? So typically the birth date of democracy is 508, 507, right? Take any dates like this with a big grain of salt, but 508, 507, all the way down to the end of the 4th century, 323 or 312, depending on how you want to count it, when democracy is snuffed out. And it's snuffed out not because of internal problems, but because of external power politics within the Macedonian Empire. So it's this time period when you have this really radical form of democracy where there's this direct form of participation. But this direct democracy generated lots of concern and complaints and critics in the classical period itself. So back to my original point, if you think about the classical period, people in the audience probably think about people like Plato, like Aristotle, like Socrates, maybe Thucydides, maybe if they read a little bit more like Xenophon or the great playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, even comic playwrights like Aristophanes. All of these people, to a greater or lesser extent, are critics of democracy. And one of the reasons for that is they come from this wealthier oligarchic class, not to generalize too much, but they live in a democracy, but they wish that they didn't. And their arguments against it are quite pointed. So already during this time period, these kind of major authors critique democracy. And, if you read anything from the 5th or 4th centuries, you probably read Plato, or you probably read Aristotle, and you read these critiques. So those critiques get picked up and carried historically, and that's the origin, at least partially, for this disinclination to move towards democracy. And democracy is also scary, right? In a certain sense, if you feel like you can kind of control the state, control the government, control the levers of power with a relatively small group that you can imagine are more rational or more able or better educated or whatever the reason is, you can hope that you'll have better outcomes or be able to control resources more and direct them appropriately. If you give it up to the people, who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah, all hell could break loose, right? Yeah, the great unwashed masses making decisions for a government can be scary to some people.
Yeah, I mean that's
so
good.
Yeah, I was going to say. So looking at, think about your first chapter, then you lay out your theoretical foundations. And one of the things that you talk about is the self and the role of the concept of the self in how we understand democracy, how we understand participation in democracy, how we understand human rights and restrictions on our freedoms and those kinds of things. And you make a comment about the pandemic, so you kind of jump forward to the current time and mention that or state that the refusal to wear masks comes out of the liberal conception of the self. It's this autonomous, free-floating sort of entity that's like sort of pre-societal. The person comes first, the individual comes first, and only later on does society come in a kind of Rousseauian perspective. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go from there and start going through the book in maybe more methodical fashion.
Sure. Yeah. So the first chapter of the book is really sort of an origin story. Like how did we get to where we are, and what are the roots of the problems that we face? I don't need to list the problems off for your audience. You probably all know them very well. You don't need to recite them. But we have all these sort of issues, and the typical way of talking about these issues are to point to the U.S. Constitution, certain restrictions in it, to point to the filibuster, but my way of thinking about this is not to say that those aren't important. They are, right? But a lot of the roots for the problems lie a bit deeper, and they go back to the beginning of the modern period. So when historians or political philosophers, I don't know about psychologists, you can speak for this, right? Talk about the modern period, they're not talking about something recent. They're talking about roughly the last 500 years, since about 1500 or 1600 up to the present time. And if you trace the ideology of how we understand the idea of the self, there's a particular version of it that begins to be presented at the beginning of this modern period in early thinkers like Descartes or Thomas Hobbes, especially, or John Locke. So this is the figure of the individual as it largely appears in liberalism. You mentioned some of the key terms: atomistic, individualistic. We think of ourselves as being totally separate and distinct from anybody else around us, not having any sort of responsibilities to them unless we agree to those responsibilities. So, you can think about this in really clear, obvious terms. Like, if God forbid, my mother needed to go into the hospital and she couldn't pay her bills, I would not be responsible for paying her bills, right? I could just say, "Oh, sorry, Mom, sucks to be you," right? And people would say, Miller is a really bad person, but they couldn't come after me legally for that, right? So this is one of the closest ties we have. You could say the same thing about my brothers or my sisters or other relatives, but the state doesn't recognize any sort of responsibilities on my part. I have responsibilities to other people, not to harm them, but it's very rare that you see some sort of affirmative responsibility instantiated in law in Western liberal democracies, right? And this goes back to this idea of the self that you see in thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, and we can go into detail about that if you want to, but in thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who hypothesize individuals as being first totally separate from whatever society they're in, right? Able to come up with their own sort of idea of what they want to pursue, their idea of the good life, and having the rational capacity to pursue those things, right? Other people in society are helpful because it's difficult to do things on your own. Cooperative action helps a lot, but people don't mean anything more to you than that there's sort of ways in which you can maximize the ability of your society to build bridges and roads and get national defense and police forces and things like that. So you have this idea of the self that's incredibly isolated, right? And not tied in any sort of deep way. So this is a trend that I see, and I'm not alone in this. I think this is a pretty common view of the early modern period among political theorists and philosophers, at least. But this is a trend that begins in the early modern period and first appears in philosophical writings, but then it eventually, right, in 200 or 300 years, it starts to become instantiated in law. And that's when it really starts to cause problems. Philosophical ideas by themselves are kind of interesting to talk about, but when they start being articulated in the world around you, it's an issue. So what does this mean in sort of practical terms, right? So in practical terms, it means, I don't have duties to other people. I only have obligations I take on myself. But in other terms, it means that, we tend to see ourselves as being isolated. There's this deep understanding of the self as not having connections to other people. And this is amplified or has been amplified, especially by COVID in the last 20 or 30 years. I don't know, some members of your audience may be familiar with a really famous political science book that was published back in the year 2000. It's called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, a Harvard political science professor. And Putnam's argument, he does research on bowling leagues, but bowling leagues stand in for all sorts of other sub-state level civic associations, right? So he's studying bowling leagues from about the end of World War II up to the mid part of the 90s when he's completing his research. And one of the things he finds, and this will be no surprise to anybody, is that bowling leagues are slowly vanishing. Fewer and fewer people are going out to bowl. And when they do go out to bowl, they go alone. And this is the case for all those other sort of sub-state level institutions, whether it's the Elks Club, the Shriners, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, whatever it is, right? All of these institutions tend to be dropping off in this post-war period. There's kind of a high in the immediate post-war period, and then in the 1970s and 80s, you have this decline. We tend to do things by ourselves. We don't tend to group with other people. And during COVID, as we all remember, this was really just knocked off the charts, right? We don't go bowling at all. We stay and watch Netflix and order, delivery, right? So we're all very isolated in this way, in sort of real ways, right? And we can't connect in some sort of way. So I trace this problem all the way back to this philosophical idea of the self that underlines really important things in liberalism, but now I think has been a little bit problematic. So the important things it underlines, if you're kind of curious about that, for these early modern thinkers, people like John Locke, in order to come up with an idea of what John Locke called natural rights, what we call human rights today, you have to have this idea of a person that exists prior to society. Rights are things, human or natural rights, are things that you possess because you're a human being, not because you're a particular member of society. Societies ought to respect them. If they don't, they should be, changed, right? But the idea is these are things that accrue to you simply by the fact that you're human. You don't need other societies around you. So this idea of this antecedent conception of the self, this self before anybody even gets together, the self that's rational, the self that has rights, the self that can understand what she wants to pursue in her life, an idea of the good life. This all comes before society. So this idea of the self, right, is always operating back there in the modern period, early modern period and up to the present time. But then certain circumstances in the United States really bring it out with a vengeance. And so now we have difficulty connecting in really fundamental ways, I think, as a result of that. I don't know, are there things that I went through too quickly?
We covered a lot right there, so I'm going to try.
I have a tendency to speak quickly. My students tell me
that's okay. I'll just
your job is to slow me down, right?
Yep, I'll just slow you down a little bit. So, just thinking about the idea of the self again. I teach a class in cross-cultural psychology every fall semester, and I have my students read selections from the Tao Te Ching alongside selections from Aristotle. So they read part of the metaphysics, very small selections. It's really not a class in philosophy, and also of his ethics. And one of the ethics passages that we read talks about the individual and individual choice, and the individual is the agent of his or her destiny, essentially. And that's something you don't find in the East. And so I think you could actually push back at least the seeds of this current conception of the self in the West goes back to Aristotle. It certainly has changed since then, but one could argue it actually goes back that far, and you start seeing this distinction between the East and the West, and individualist collectors on the one, individual societies on the one hand, and collectivistic societies on the other hand, the independent self on the one hand, the interdependent self on the other hand. And perhaps to push it back even further than the modern period, although certainly it has changed and become exaggerated, as you've already suggested, in the last few centuries. So let me ask you, you talk about
well, can I just pick that up for a second?
Oh, sure.
So I guess I would make I wouldn't locate this as beginning with Aristotle, and I see what you're saying about him, but think about the way that he starts his really important work on political science, the politics, right? He says human beings are always in community with one another. He says, if you're not a member of a political community, you're either a beast or a god. This is like 2 pages into the politics. It's one of the introductory things he says. So you're a beast, you're less than human, or you're a god, you're more than human. But if you're human, you need to be a part of a political community, and that human beings can only discover the good life within a polis, within a city-state, a Greek city-state, within a political community, in other words. And so for Aristotle, you're prevented from the get-go of having this sort of idea of the self in the abstract, outside of the state, outside of civil society. This idea appears, I think, at least in the Western tradition. I can't speak for Confucianism, at least not with any authority, right? But it appears in the Western tradition really at around 1500, 1600 in some of these early writers. And you can think about this if you kind of want an historical explanation for it, right? Think about what else is going on at this time period. Europeans have just, discovered what they think is a new continent, the new world. And there are these reports circulating, filtering back in that people like Thomas Hobbes read, and it fires their imagination. What are human beings like in this condition where they don't think there's any society, they don't think there's any state, they don't think there's any really organized directive force for individuals. I mean, it's a total fantasy on their part, but it fires their imagination. It makes them think of human beings in this isolated way. So this, in a certain sense, you could connect this to the discovery of the New World. You could also connect this to certain growing notions of commodity trading, nascent forms of capitalism, and the idea of contracts that are appearing during this time period as well. And that gets amplified in later theological debates in Calvinism and things like that. So I guess I would locate it really firmly there. And if you look back earlier, you tend to see people as being identified not antecedently to society. They're products of a particular political community. They're good Christians. They're members of a particular polis. Right. One of the really kind of striking things, the first time you really read a lot of Greek philosophy or Greek literature in general, is that there is no conception of natural rights there. There's no conception of human rights. They don't have the idea that simply because you're human, you get certain things. You have privileges, right? But those privileges are given to you by your society. So the word that's translated as right in English translations is a word that's probably better translated as a share. I have a share in the city, right? I'm like a shareholder in the city. So a right isn't something that I hold over and against the rest of society, over and against the state. It's something that the state has given to me, that society has given to me. And of course, if the state can give it to you, the state can take it back as well, which is a little scary for liberals. So that idea of this kind of distinct self, I have a hard time seeing that. It's not that people can't take actions. It's not that people can't and don't. Right?
Yeah. I'm not arguing that point. At least, I mean, I'm certainly not going to tell you what Aristotle said. I'm not.
No, but I'd love to have a debate about it.
But I'm thinking that at least some of the things that he said were they're different than what was said in the East at about the same time, in terms of the self as being this independent agent. Not necessarily prior to society, the way you're talking about in the modern times, but there were differences where you wouldn't see that language in the East. You wouldn't see that in Confucius. You wouldn't see that in Taoism. You wouldn't see that in Mansu or some of the other individuals. So that was it's just the C is what I'm talking about, not the full-fledged notion of the self, because that has changed, as you said, quite a bit over the last few hundred years.
Yeah, I should add that this idea. So I take the point there. This idea of the self that appears in Hobbes and Locke, these early social contract thinkers, especially, right, is almost immediately challenged, right? So people like Rousseau, later Hegel, of course Marx, right, take up a much more embedded idea of the self, and they're rejecting this atomistic idea. So they're kind of two trends in modernity. One leads to various forms of liberalism, and the other leads to counter-liberal, sometimes counter-modern traditions, right, on the left generally.
Yeah. So let's go to your first content chapter, in a sense, in the book on ostracism. And so before reading your book, I was thinking of ostracism as being, a bunch of teenagers or 12-year-olds, whatever, or, their friends, and somebody misbehaves or does something he shouldn't do or she shouldn't do and gets kind of rejected for a while or stigmatized for a while and loses their friend group, something kind of that along those veins, or along that vein, kind of mild, no real serious repercussions. And then reading your book, I realized that for the Greeks, for the Athenians anyway, this idea was very, very different from what, it seems to have been used as, and, used to mean here in this culture, in this country in recent years. So, they did something that was quite drastic relative to how we see ostracism in this society today. And can you just talk about what that is and why they did it?
Sure. This is a practice that we think is as old as democracy itself. And, I should just note here, probably your audience knows this, but our sourcing for this time period is somewhat limited. We have limited information. You often have to kind of read between the lines to get stuff. So take everything I say with a little bit of a grain of salt here. There's a little bit of room for interpretation, but generally speaking, we think ostracism appears right around the same time that democracy appears in Athens. So around the beginning of the 5th century, 500 or 400, right? Or so. So what is it? Ostracism, the term actually just means an ostracon is just a piece of pottery, a broken piece of pottery, right? So ostraka for plural. In Athens, in the ancient world, pots were a major way of conveying goods. So on the street in Athens, there's probably a lot of different pieces of pottery on the ground, right? So it's just a piece of pottery. But what the Athenians decided to do early on in the 5th century is that they initiated a two-step process to decide who to kick out of the city for a period of time. So they'd have a vote in early January for us, whether or not to hold an ostracism. They gather all the citizens together, or all the citizens that wanted to come together, and the citizens would vote. And if they voted not to have an ostracism, that was the end of it. But if they voted to have an ostracism, then they reassembled in March, roughly in March, for the actual ostracism vote. And for the vote, you as an average citizen would pick up a pottery shard from the ground, and you'd inscribe the name of somebody you disliked on this pottery shard. And then there's a big ceremonial procedure, but all the Athenians came together in various groups, and there's a high ceremony, and you deposited all of your pottery shards in a pile, and then there was a count, and there was a minimum threshold. There had to be 6,000 votes for it to be legitimate. But assuming you make the $600,000 threshold, the winner, the person with the most votes, had to leave the city of Athens for a period of 10 years. They didn't suffer any financial penalty. They kept their property. If their family wanted to stay or their relatives, they could stay. But that person had to leave for 10 years. They could come back after 10 years, but they had to go away for 10 years. No other penalties associated with it. This is a really shocking and as it turns out, I think rather effective means of controlling individuals who had too much power to sit comfortably in a democracy. So if you think about that moment when you pick up the pottery sherd, right? I could put the person whose office is next door to me, I could put that person's name on the pottery sherd and vote for him, but nobody else is going to vote for that guy. Nobody's going to vote for my neighbor because they don't know who he's going to vote for. So who wins ostracisms? Well, the wealthy, the rich, the powerful. Right? And the really interesting thing about this is you don't have to have done anything illegal to be ostracized. You don't have to have broken a law, right? You have, however, warped the space of democracy, right? And for reasons that we all know, right? Kind of instinctively today in the 20th century, power, money, wealth warps that democratic space. You're so unequal to everybody else that you make democratic politics impossible around you. So one of the things that the Athenian Democrats, the Athenian population is saying to these wealthy people is, I'm putting it nicely, right? But you have too much power. You're not compatible with the democracy. You haven't done anything wrong, but you can't stay here. Please go away for 10 years. So we have instances where people were ostracized, then they came back, and then they were ostracized again. These must have been really, one of the guys who had this happen to him was named Megacles, and his name parses out mega, great, lots of, right? And kleos, power, or I'm sorry, glory, great glory is sort of his name, the glorious one. He gets ostracized twice in a row. We know this happened a couple of different times. So this is a way for the Athenian demos to control the influence of wealth and power, and also sometimes to decide decisively between competing aristocratic or oligarchic factions in the city. By ostracizing one person, you send them away and they're gone. Now, it's interesting that the Athenians chose this as opposed to other things they could have done. They could have executed the person. They could have taken their property away from them. They could have, banned them in perpetuity. Right. Now, we don't have anybody writing about this specifically, but we can speculate. So what's the benefit of an ostracism? The ostracism promises the potential of a return, promises the potential of a reconciliation. If you send someone away and you confiscate their property or you harm them, their family in some sort of way, they'll be more likely to be aggrieved. Perhaps they're going to come back with an army, right? Perhaps they're going to try to undermine Athens. But ostracism is a sort of more gentle way of just saying, hey, you can't be here now. So we have this practice. It's largely a practice that's attested to in the 5th century, so in the first 100 years of Athenian democracy. In the 4th, it's replaced by some other mechanisms. But it's this really kind of amazing, way in which the Athenians recognize the incompatibility of wealth with basic democratic values of equality. Right, equality is very important for the Athenians, right? And if you have too much wealth, too much power, too much fame, you can't be equal, and you can't function as a citizen.
Yeah, and one of the several parallels that you've made between ancient Greece and contemporary United States is about this issue, this concern about wealth and power as being, kind of centered in a small number of people who can control too much of public policy, too much of the government, and so forth. So it's the parallel is striking there that we're also concerned trying to find ways today to reduce the power of money, the influence of money, the wealthy, the powerful, etc. And that's a fascinating way of doing that. I'm not sure we could do it in this country anymore. No. You suggest the same thing in your book. And you send somebody to France for 10 years and they can still talk to their friends in the United States and see them every day. And the way money flows around, you really can't even prevent money from just having the same influence that it had before. So that kind of thing wouldn't work that well now, but it's just a fascinating and interesting way of trying to solve this problem that they had that I think at this point can't really use.
Yeah, it helps to think about it not so much as focused on sending someone out, but cutting back the power of someone who has this sort of ability, right? So, like you say, we can't send someone to France, right? There's certain restrictions on what we can do to people constitutionally in the United States, of course, right? So we can't do that, but we tend to think of, so then we tend to throw up our hands. Well, what can we do? But what the Athenians are telling us, I think, is that things like money, lots of money, right, warp the democratic space around you. So you need to have sort of ways of effectively cutting the ability of wealthy people off from influencing politics. And there are lots of different ways to do this. It points, very practically in the direction of campaign finance reforms, spending limits on campaigns, right? Other sorts of restrictions on who can do political advertising and to what extent, right? So these are all things that I think are eminently doable. But the example of ostracism makes you think that, this is important. Right? It's not just, we can't restrict their freedom of speech and we can't restrict their freedom of movement and we can't restrict their ability to acquire capital. Democracy requires other things as well. Sure, yeah, we want people to be able to have enough money, be able to speak, but we also want people to be equal. So it's really sort of a question of raising equality up, right, in terms of the priority level we have for these different aspects of what are important to us. I think at the beginning of that chapter, I actually talk about Donald Trump a little bit. And when I was writing that chapter, just right in the middle of it, right, Donald Trump was deplatformed from Twitter. You must all remember that. And this was a really crucial time in the United States, right? The inauguration of Joe Biden was just like 2 weeks away. And Trump was on Twitter saying the things that Trump said. And there was the real threat of further violence instigated by Trump and his Twitter account. And so when Twitter deplatformed him, right, you could almost feel the temperature in the country drop down, right? Because he no longer had that voice. He couldn't mobilize his troops. And of course, Biden got inaugurated and it was peaceful. It's hypothetical. It's hard to prove the negative, but you might make the argument that the deplatforming of Trump made it possible for Biden to be peacefully inaugurated. That's a form of ostracism, right? It's not kicking him out of the country, but it's depriving him of a voice. So I think, we need to rethink how we understand sorts of megaphones that power, wealth, and fame give you in a democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the trick there is how do you do that in ways that are within the confines of the Constitution and of our legal framework? Because we do guarantee these individual rights, and it's how do we actually accomplish equality without at the same time infringing upon these rights? And it's a really tricky challenge, I think, that for us to face. And so one of the things another strategy that the Greeks used is sortition, which was in part designed to prevent the same kind of accumulation of wealth or at least of power in ancient Greece. So wondering, it's a term that most of us don't know what that means. So you can talk about what sortition means and how it was implemented in Athens.
Sure.
The mechanisms you describe in your book are just fascinating to me, and putting a little the coins or little nuggets in and deciding who they want to vote for. And the whole lottery system is also quite fascinating and foreign to how we think about how we should run our government, how we should choose our elected leaders. Our leaders, not elected, but leaders. So tell us about sortition and how it worked in ancient Greece.
Sure. This is a really fascinating aspect of Athenian democracy. I think most people think about the Athenian assembly, if they think about the Athenian democracy at all, but Athens was a big city, roughly 300,000 people, right, within a larger area. So it was substantial size for the ancient world, pretty big for the ancient world. And it had lots of functions that had to occur on a regular basis. So lots of offices that had to be filled. We think of offices as being filled by appointment or by election for the higher level offices. The Athenians filled almost every office for 200 years on the basis of a lottery, right? So this is kind of functionally the equivalent of taking a phone book back when we had a phone book. You remember those? Open it up, you point to someone, right? And you're going to be on this job for the year, right? And so what the Athenians would do is they'd appoint, for most positions, they'd appoint boards of people, usually 10. So there might be someone, for example, a board of people that were in charge of cleaning up the streets or making sure that the streets in the marketplace, the agora, were in shape every morning. And there'd be 10 people selected at random from the citizen body who were assigned to this board for a year. Now you get paid to do this work, of course. And if you had no experience doing it before, chances are someone on the board has done something like it or something, or maybe the same job previously. And so they kind of understand what's going on there. If there are 10 people on that board, there's room for one person to be kind of checked out or not competent at all. right? But you have these 10 people that are in charge of this. So this went from, relatively minor things like cleaning up the agora to really important things, significant portions of military operations, not the very top level, but significant portions of military operations, significant portions of preparedness, or, building walls in the city or regulating trade. All of these things were done by boards of citizens that were selected at random. And of course, when you select someone at random, you're very unlikely to get someone that's wealthy. You're very unlikely to get someone that's powerful, just because the odds are against it. And because these positions didn't pay very much, even if you picked someone who was wealthy or powerful, they probably had better things to do with their time. So these boards were by and large staffed with average citizens. Now, what does this say about Athens? Well, it says they're suspicious of elections, right? But it also says that they have had a great deal of faith in the ability of average citizens to be able to do things, sometimes quite complex things, technically complex things, on their own, with advice, with help from other people. It's a great deal of reliance on the average person to actually act and do things. So, if you think about all these different boards of citizens, right, doing these different actions that keep the city together, it's really kind of astonishing, because the assembly might meet, on average, the assembly, the Athenian Congress, right, would meet maybe 40 times a year, and they decide we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Sometimes it's a minor thing, like we're going to change this statue here, or demolish this building, or build a new one over here, or it could be a major one. We're going to go to war and we're going to send ships off. There's no bureaucracy in Athens, at least in the sense that we understand it, that then is charged with putting that program into effect. It goes to all these boards of individual citizens. It's just an average people, and they leave the assembly and they go to work and they produce it. So again, sometimes this can mean going into battle or preparing for a battle. Sometimes it can mean doing something that's not so enjoyable. So all of these offices in Athens are distributed on the basis of lottery. To be eligible, you had to be an adult male citizen. So Athens is a little bit restrictive in terms of who they allow. But for the ancient world, this is kind of an extraordinary grant of power to average people that's not duplicated until the modern times in any substantial way. So it's really quite astonishing. The assembly itself was the body of all citizens who wanted to meet. And I said it before, I think I said it meets about 40 times a year, we think. We think about between 6,000 and 8,000 people would attend these assembly meetings on average. The assembly meetings, the agenda for the assembly meetings was set before the assembly meeting by what was called a boule, or a council. And this council was sort of an executive function of the Athenian government. And the members of this council, there are 500 people, were also selected on the basis of a lottery. So these are the people that on a day-to-day basis are sort of running things. They're all selected from the very broad geographic region of Attica, right? And they're all selected on the basis of a lottery. So they're in there, average citizens running things. And even within that council, which is democratically selected on the basis of a lottery, the leadership for any given day shifts between different groupings in that. And the leader, kind of the de facto titular head of state for Athens on any given day, is also someone who's decided on the basis of a lottery. So one of the really astonishing things about the Athenian democracy is that if you're an average citizen participating in the work of the government, work of the city, you stand a not bad chance of one day being president for the whole shebang, right? No guarantee you'll do it. Odds are probably slightly
Fun
against.
thought experiment.
Yeah, but I mean, can you imagine one day you're going to be in the White House? You get to be, Joe Biden for a day. It's kind of the equivalent of it, right? So this is quite astonishing. Now, to make this happen, Athens had to provide a certain amount of revenue to people who did this, right? Most people can't afford to take time off to do this, but if you were an Athenian citizen doing the work of Athens, you could make a living wage, right? You pay for yourself, pay for your family. You're not going to get rich off of it, but it does allow, in fact, it even encourages poorer members of the city to participate, right? So what was once kind of restricted to the wealthy, just in a de facto sense that, they're the ones that have the time to do this, maybe the knowledge to do this, but the use of the lottery kind of expands that rather dramatically.
Yeah, so I was reading this chapter, I was thinking this is an interesting thought experiment. That is that this is the work back in Athens 2,000 years ago. And I was wondering to myself, does it work now? And then in your chapter, you lay out a few examples of this kind of process working in the United States. I think one's in maybe in Canada.
Mhm.
So clearly it can work today. It's not very common right now, but can you just share with the audience one or two examples of how this does work today and how
Sure.
it's functioning effectively today? But I want to
Sure.
also ask you, you live in Rosendale, and have you ever raised this question with anybody in Rosendale? You have a board, or a town council, I think, that runs your city.
Mhm.
So and
Mhm.
what do people say there about this idea of
Yeah.
a whole new system of picking their leaders?
Yeah. So, in contrast to ostracism, which you point out rightly, it has lots of kind of constitutional hurdles, legal hurdles to get over in the United States. I'm actually pretty optimistic about the idea of sortition or lotteries. And there's a lot of experiments going on with this around the world, not just in Canada, but in other places as well. Probably the most impressive one recently is the city of Paris that, it's 2023, last January, they instituted what they call a citizens assembly. Sometimes these are called mini publics too, right? And the citizens assembly is a permanent body that's drawn from the residents of the city of Paris, right? The entire metropolitan area, right? And they sit for a year and they deliberate and they make recommendations to the Parisian legislature. Note that I said it's residents of Paris. So you could be a non-citizen living there and be selected for this. You could be, someone that's living there temporarily and be selected for this. Now there are all sorts of, it's a complex system by which they select people, but here you have this city that's basically set up a permanent representative body that's based on lotteries to resolve complex legislative issues. And, the reason for it should be pretty clear to anybody who's watched a contemporary legislature try to debate and deliberate over a difficult issue. We have all sorts of problems with, industry capture of different forms of legislation, campaign donations, all the things that make assemblies and legislatures in our own Congress a little bit sclerotic and unable to move. Maybe a little bit is not enough, completely unable to move on some issues, right? One of the things the Parisians are thinking is, we're going to punt some of these problems over to this different group of people who aren't constrained in the same way that elected officials tend to be. So Paris is doing it as a city. Iceland's been experimenting with this for a long time. There are a number of these up in Ireland. There was also another all France citizens assembly on climate change. I guess it's like 4 or 5 years ago. Some cities in Belgium do this. So this is something that's actually happening around the world, and different places are experimenting with it. Alas, here in the United States, we're a little behind the curve on this. We're not experimenting with it so much, although I should say, I think the impetus for trying some of these things out is building. Just up the road from me here in New Paltz at Bard College at the Hannah Arendt Center, they have an initiative to institute citizens' assemblies, mini publics, in local villages and towns in the mid-Hudson Valley, which is very interesting. They're just starting out, but there might be some progress there on this question. So, if you take Justice Brandeis's suggestion that the states are the laboratories of democracy seriously, right, we can experiment with these. They don't require any changes to the law necessarily. They don't require any changes to the Constitution. All a village board or a town council or a city council has to say is, we're going to punt this question over to the Citizens Assembly, and we'll either consider the result and vote on it, or we'll just ratify whatever they give to us. And so you sort of sidestep the legitimacy question for it by having them formally go through the legislature. So, my hope is that there's some experimentation with these, and we see what tends to work and what's effective. So where these things seem like they're most effective, you have to build in a lot of insurance that you're getting a group of people who are really representative of the population that you're looking at. You have to supply them with enough money and resources to actually evaluate issues seriously. You have to pay them. Sometimes you have to pay for childcare, right, or transportation for some people. So there's this kind of whole host of different things you kind of need to take care of. But in terms of finances, especially for large states like the United States, it's not that big of a deal. right? And you can get some startlingly astonishing, good results from these. So I should say that the places it's been tried, the results have been mixed. I think the one that you referred to up in British Columbia, they were reevaluating their basic legal code there, and the Citizens Assembly there failed to be able to come to an adequate conclusion that would be accepted in a referendum by the people. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I view this as very much in the experimental phase, right? So we'll kind of hopefully develop methods that make these bodies more effective.
And one of the things that is appealing about this idea is that people talk about how do we argue about how can we eliminate the power of money in elections. So, for example, we spend millions and millions of dollars on elections. Sometimes even local elections now become much more expensive than they had been 30, 40 years ago. Yep. And I hear people say, well, why don't we have term limits? If somebody can only spend 6 years in a House of Representatives, then we can actually reduce the influence of money there, because they can't spend year after year after year after year accumulating wealth and healthy and wealthy donors and et cetera. But I seriously wonder if that's actually a solution, because even if as long as you have elections, there will be money involved. It might be different people running every 6 years or whatever it may be if you have 3-term limits in the House. But nevertheless, you still have elections. If you look at even elections like the George Santos election recently in New York and Johanna Hayes here in Connecticut, and there were sort of lower stakes in some of it, but there was still a lot of out-of-state money spent on those two elections. And even though they were new people running, it did not reduce the power of money or the influence of money in those elections. So sortition would actually eliminate that, because there would be no election to fund. There would be no person you could put money in their back pocket and get them to vote for you, because they're going to be gone anyway after in the next sortition round. And so it just seems like that would be a much more effective way, if we could do it, given the legal restrictions involved. That would be a more effective way of actually reducing the influence of money in politics in the United States.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to bribe or financially influence a Citizens Assembly than it is individual legislatures. And like you point out, the solutions that have been posed to the problem, like term limits, aren't necessarily solutions, right? If you term limit people out, that maybe they have more incentive to angle for that job in industry afterwards by writing favorable legislation for the particular industry. So that's not really a solution in that sense. So the basic problem, I think, lies with elections themselves and the money that's spent on elections. There are short-term things we can do, right? We can try to have more effective campaign finance laws. We probably need a different Supreme Court to do this, but we can try to make movements in that direction. We could shorten the campaigning season. In most liberal democracies, most parliamentary democracies, campaign seasons are actually very short compared to the United. I mean, we're already in the next presidential election, right? It's a long ways off, right? In fact, they never really stop here, right? So there are different ways that you can kind of fiddle around the edges, but a really big move would be to move to these lottery-based mini publics or citizens' assemblies.
Mm-hmm. So another way that you talk about in the book in terms of how the Greeks tried to eliminate or reduce the influence of money, and also the inequality that was there, was to force people who are wealthy to fund the government. And government activities. You talked about some festivities that were done that were managed by, sponsored by, handled by the government, but yet private citizens were forced to pay for those things. And that's a fascinating concept. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Democratic Athens had the most progressive taxation system in history, I often say to my students. Average Athenian citizens in normal times were not taxed by the city. There may be some other taxes they pay, but not by the city itself. The primary tax burden was shouldered by the wealthiest people. They're kind of equivalent of the 1% or the half of 1%. And every year, the Athenian Treasury Board would get together and they decide what Athens needed, what big expenses were coming up. And so you can think of some of these in relatively discrete terms, like, the main warship of the Athenian Navy was called a trireme. It's a very effective, advanced piece of military technology for the time. So the military board and the Treasury Board might get together and say, hey, we need X number of triremes, 100, 150, 200 triremes this year. How are we going to pay for them? Because they're very expensive, right? You have to pay for the crews, you have to feed the crews, you have to do all the equipment, the maintenance of the boats. It's a lot of money. And they'd take a look at the roster of the wealthiest citizens. And in the 5th and most of the 4th century, they'd find one individual and say, you're going to pay for this warship for the entire year, right? And that means everything, right? You're responsible for the whole thing. This was called a liturgy. A liturgy is, we have that word in English, but for the Greeks, it means a work or a service. And this particular form of a liturgy was called a trierarchia. You pay for a trierarchy or for a trireme. So it's kind of like the equivalent of taking, I don't know, Elon Musk and saying, hey, you're responsible for paying for the USS Enterprise this year. It's kind of like that, right? So this meant that the wealthiest people shouldered this burden, and they had this very interesting way in which they made the wealthy compete amongst one another, right, to not or take these liturgies. So if I, for example, if I'm a very wealthy person and I'm assigned a trierarchia as a liturgy, and my neighbor who's also wealthy and I think has more money than me didn't get a liturgy, I could sue him in court. And I could say, you know what, it was called an antidosis. It means I'm so sure you have more money than I do that I'm willing to swap all of my property with you if you're not willing to take this liturgy, right? So it had this effect of making the members of the wealthiest classes of Athens, who all knew who each other were and had pretty good ideas of each other's assets, to kind of out one another and say, no, he has a lot of money, no, he has a lot of money, that family over there. And we have actual court records of these lawsuits going before Athenian juries, randomly selected, of course, right, to resolve them. So here's this way in which, you know, major revenue sources were the wealthiest people. And, you know, what if you were an average or a poor Athenian, you didn't give money to the state gives money to you, right? Because you wake up, you go to the assembly, you go to whatever board you're on, or you serve in the law courts, or you serve in the military, rowing in the fleet or fighting in a hoplite phalanx, and you get paid for it. Right. So again, it kind of encourages the citizens that use that wealth, right, at the top level, to encourage the citizens to participate in the democracy. There are all sorts of these liturgies, not just the really top level ones. Interestingly, in Athens, the two most expensive generally liturgies, and this gives you a good idea about what Athenians are like. One of them is the paying for a trireme, a worship for a year. But the other most expensive was paying for the production of a trilogy of plays at one of the major play festivals, the Festival of Dionysus every year. They spent as much on a play production and the associated festivities as they did on a worship for the entire year. So that gives you some sense of balance there.
I love that idea.
Isn't it?
Imagine
we need to fund our arts a little more, don't you think?
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to do here, but I wish we could do more of it.
Yeah.
Let me go to some questions now that the audience have asked. I have more on my list, but I'll hold off on those for now and then ask you a couple from here.
Sure.
So somebody has asked, and you kind of addressed this earlier, but I'm going to ask the question again anyway to clarify. They ask, can you define citizenship in ancient Greece? Did it just include men, and were there any restrictions on what men, which men?
Yeah.
And was there any debate there about including women in that process,
yeah,
you know, as citizens who could vote?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's an important one, right? Because we shouldn't forget that even though, you know, by the standards of the ancient world, you know, power is dispersed very broadly, right? It's dispersed only to men, and then only to a certain section of men, adult male citizens. So not even all male citizens in Athens. So demographics are difficult to come by, but kind of a commonly accepted number for the total population of Attica. So that's the city of Athens and the immediate area around it that's under its control. At any point during this time period is roughly 300,000 people. So if you take that 300,000 people and you divide it up, about 100,000 of those people are citizens. So that includes men, women, and children. About 100,000 of those people are kind of like registered aliens, resident aliens, people with green cards, basically, in our terms. And then about 100,000 of those people are slaves, right? These latter two groups, metics and slaves, no participation at all, right? Slaves had almost no civic rights, and the metics, the registered aliens, had limited civic rights. But then even if you look at that slice of, you know, citizens, right, you're probably looking at 30 to 40,000 of them that are adult males and 60,000 that are women and children, right? So of the 300,000 people in the space, really full franchise goes just to the adult male citizens. And adult means for them, it's roughly 18 or 19. You actually take a loyalty oath, a citizenship oath when you're 18. You're brought before your local dean council and your father's there and he has a friend and they both vouch that you're the father's son, and then you're enrolled in the citizen list. So it happens around the age of 18, you do that. And then there are certain offices that you need to be a little bit older to serve on a jury. You have to be at least 30, and there's some other age restrictions. But basically, things are open to you at that point. But it's still a small section of the population. Women are considered to be citizens, and they have some limited rights, but they generally can't own property. They can't represent themselves in court. There's this sort of ideal. Thucydides has Pericles, the great Athenian general of the Peloponnesian War and civic leader of the mid part of the 5th century, say kind of notoriously in a speech, a funeral oration at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War. He has Pericles say, "Oh, and as for the women, right? The best thing would be if we didn't know you exist, right? And we didn't know anything about you either in praise or in blame, right?" So that's kind of an astonishing statement, right? The best woman is a woman we don't know exists. She's even better than the one we hear good things about, right? Now that's an ideal, right? Only the upper class could afford to keep their women cloistered in that way, but it still tells you something about society. So it's a misogynistic society. It's divided. It's very hierarchical. A lot of this citizen work is made possible by the presence of slaves. So we shouldn't kid ourselves about any of that. Probably wouldn't be a good place for most of us to live. But again, just to emphasize, by the standards of the time, this is viewed as an extraordinarily radical and dangerous extension of power to average people.
Yeah, good. So another question has to do with the founding fathers, which we raised a little while ago. The person's asking that they're saying that they seem to anticipate the way that power could actually corrupt individuals and corrupt government, but not about money so much. They weren't concerned about the role of money, and of course, elections were a new thing essentially at that point. But so the person's asking, were the founding fathers aware of how ancient Athens dealt with this issue of money's influence over politics and over power?
Well, the only person I could speak with some authority on is Thomas Jefferson, because I went to the University of Virginia and we kind of went with the territory. I was actually a docent at Monticello for the summer. Even Thomas Jefferson, who was fluent in ancient Greek, right? I don't think he knew any of this. There's no evidence that he was aware of these sorts of things. A lot of this stuff has surfaced subsequent to that time period. So a couple of texts, especially that deal with the inner workings of the Athenian polis, appeared in the late 19th century. So he just wouldn't have, even if he was interested, he couldn't have found it. Typically, someone who was educated during that time period would read Plato and Aristotle and Thucydides. Those they had access to, those they knew. But again, as I said before, Plato and Aristotle and Plato and Socrates especially, right, are devastatingly critical of democracies, right? Socrates has this kind of regular patter where he says, if you want your shoe fixed, who do you go to? A cobbler. If you want your boat fixed, who do you go to? A shipwright, right? Are you just going to turn to the average guy in the street and put him in charge of the government? That's crazy. They have no knowledge, right? So this regular theme, right, about the dangers of putting people who don't have the right sort of expertise, and by that they mean a good education that money can give you, right, in charge. So that's what they would have. That's the spring they would have drank from when they're understanding ancient Greece. So we're in a position to understand things a little bit differently now and amplify different sides of things. But I should say that it's still not really common at least in a philosophy class or in a political theory class to talk about this side of Athenian democracy. And part of the problem there is that we have no democratic philosophers, right? All these guys that are writing philosophy are aristocratic. They're very wealthy and very well connected, and they share the prejudices of their class to some degree or another. So, to get the democratic angle on it, to get the democratic theory, you have to read democratic sources, and those are trickier to deal with because nobody's making linear arguments there. You have to kind of pick and choose and kind of put a kind of collage together to get it. And that wasn't something they had the resources to do during the founding period.
Another member asked this question, do you see the need to have elections? Or would you see the need if you were to pattern the political system in the United States on the Athenian political system? So if we were, I guess the question is, if we were more like them, could we then do away with elections?
Well, maybe the premise of the question is if we were more like them, right? So one common critique of lotteries, for example, sortition, is that Athens is, by our standards, extraordinarily homogenous, right? They're ethnically homogenous, they're linguistically homogenous, they have a common belief system. It's a little bit scattered, but it basically holds them together. They're geographically discrete in a particular territory. So there are all these things that are going for them that make the type of things that go on in Athens more possible in this more homogenous society. And in the United States, we're quite diverse, right? It's very difficult to get 50 people in the room together and have them all have the same opinion, right? So we're different along religious belief lines, sort of political beliefs. Racially we're different, right? So there are all these things that make us a lot different from Athens. So the question is, can this sort of thing work? And I don't know, it would take more time than we have tonight, but a lot of the evidence coming in from these experiments with mini publics and sortition devices show that you actually can get good results from these relatively diverse representative bodies if they're, put given the right resources and given the time to deliberate things. I guess that the closest analogy that people in the audience might understand are jury deliberations. I had the chance for the first time in my life last year, I was called to serve on a grand jury. And I'd been called to jury service before, but I was always excluded. I was never seated on a jury. But for a grand jury, it turns out there's no voir dire, you're just put on it. So I'm there, and it's this room with, we had about 30 people on the grand jury, and they were really different people. It was up in Kingston, so it was a diverse crowd. And I can tell you, there were Republicans, there were Conservative Party members in there, there were lefties, there were Democrats, there were Working Families Party members, because I talked with them all. And you see over the course of the 2 months that we were together. And I have never been so impressed by a group of people who took seriously the task of deliberations in these admittedly very serious issues. Charges were brought. Do we want to, affirm the charges, or do we want to deny the charges? And there were real serious differences of opinion, but we worked things out. We almost always came to some sort of conclusion that was mutually acceptable. And if we disagreed, we agreed to disagree. So it was this really kind of an eye-opening experience for me, because I don't come into contact with that sort of outside of my classroom, and that's a different situation, right? Because I'm in charge, right? I don't come into that sort of context too often where you have to deliberate with peers in that sort of way that are that different from you. So I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, I would love to actually do that. I always get dismissed as well for regular juries, but never been called for grand jury, and would love to have the experience.
Yeah.
I had a friend who was on one for 6 months, and so they met once every 2 weeks for hours at a time. And
it's a long commitment.
yeah, it was, but he found the experience quite fascinating.
Yeah.
So another question, if America really is in crisis, so if democracy really is in crisis now, if we don't make changes to it, how long do you think democracy will last? Are we sort of at the very end of the rope essentially now, and if we don't change quickly, we're going to just go away and become authoritarian, or go in some other direction, have a civil war, or so how urgent, I guess, is the crisis?
I'm really reluctant to get into the predictions business. But if you'd have asked me this before the last presidential election, I would have been much more pessimistic about it. I'm not relieved at this point, right? But I'm a little more optimistic about the future at this point. But I really do think that we have some serious problems, and the problems are epistemic problems, in the sense that we're having difficulty communicating with one another. This is something that everybody knows, right? We don't agree on the same set of facts, or even if we do, what those facts mean. Thucydides, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, tells this really chilling story of a small city called Corcyra. It's right at the beginning of the history of the Peloponnesian War. It's really the precipitating event. It's a small city that devolves into factionalism and then into civil war. And Thucydides traces the steps here. First the sides fought against one another and they killed their political enemies. Then they started killing people that owed them money or that they could take money from. Then they killed people they didn't like. Then sons started to kill their fathers, fathers' sons, family members fought. And then at the very nadir, at the very bottom of this conflict, Thucydides has these really chilling lines, right? He says, and words lost their meaning, right? People were unable to communicate. Language failed them because they didn't have a common set of references. And the scariest thing of all about this is that at this point, the city, Kusara, drops off the map. It just vanishes because there is no coming back from that, right? There's no baseline from which you can rescue yourself. And it seems to me that we are perilously close to that, right? When I talk to my Republican friends, my people in my neighborhood who are Trump supporters, and, we're nice and polite, but they have a very different understanding of reality from me. How to bridge that gap is really difficult. And that, I think, is the most dangerous thing, right? Not to diminish, sort of the constitutional problems or the other divisive issues in society, but that's a big one, right? If we can't share a common language, if we can't listen to other people, how do we recover from that? So, are we headed for authoritarianism? Probably not dramatically, but there could be a slow slide towards it. You watch what's happening in other liberal democracies or quasi-liberal democracies in Hungary and in Turkey, what almost happened in Brazil. You see
In Florida.
in Florida, in certain states. Yeah, fair enough, right? In certain states. So, there is this sort of slow drift where you can kind of start losing key aspects of democratic people control, key levers that can bring us back. So I'm worried.
Yeah, so am I. So I interviewed Yuval Levine a few years ago. He and Yuval Levine and William Galston, and we discussed some of these same themes there. We talked about this loss of community. We talked about bowling alone, and Levine has some proposed solutions as well, which are not incompatible with yours, but a little bit different from yours. And he argues that we need to find some way to restore our trust in institutions, that institutions in this country have lost the legitimacy. We don't trust them anymore. And we don't want to participate because we don't trust them. And so what he argues is that what we should be doing is trying to find a way to retrust, to reinvigorate, to reform our institutions, both governmental and non-governmental institutions. But at the same time, so trust them again, but at the same time, join them and change them so that we can trust them. So it isn't a matter of just saying, yes, we like, also we like, we didn't like yesterday, we like today. It's a matter of, I'm going to change that thing so I can join it. Then I can become a fan of it, as it were. We can make it legitimate. And so he's talking about that level. He doesn't discuss, elections very much. It's really about just institutions and even, the nonprofits around the corner and local governments and all the way through. So again, it's really about us participating more in institutions, changing them to make them what they used to be, according to Levine anyway. When we trusted them more, we felt belonging to those, we felt like we were needed, and they gave us some meaning to our lives and helped guide us on what a good life might actually be. And so he finds his mid-levels where we're losing a lot of the community that we need to have, like Putnam argues, like you were arguing earlier on. So what are your thoughts on that kind of solution? It's a little vague, a little general, but it's a little bit different what you're talking about.
I agree. But I would say, you need to, participating at the institutional level is one thing. But I think the real problem, again, is sort of the inability of people to meet and talk in the public sphere with people that have different views or different backgrounds. That happens very rarely. So, in a simple terms, people need to get out of their houses and they need to go out and they need to enter the civic sphere. Now that can be going to a village board meeting or something else, or participating in that sense and trying to reclaim things that way. But it can also be just, instituting civic festivals or, occupying civic spaces, not in a hostile way, but just being there. And talking with people that you're not familiar with. So one of the things that I've done in my hometown in Rosendale is I instituted a discussion series with the help of the local library where we talked about these political issues, right? And we had a reading list and, 10 or 15 people get together and you meet weekly and you talk through these things. And the idea was we get people from different parts of Rosendale. It's a pretty diverse community economically. And we try to, not solve the problems of the world, but really build up the resources of trust, right, of camaraderie and respect that I think are the precursors to any sort of effective political action. So I think the retreat to the private sphere, the retreat to the household, away from the bowling leagues, have really done us some serious damage. We're unable, it's like a disability. We're unable to talk to people that aren't in our little bubble, right? And I include myself in this group. I probably like you, I'm surrounded by professors most of the time. I talk mostly with professors, and they're a bunch of liberal Democrats, right? So I'm very unlikely to be challenged on anything that I think. But if I go to one of these discussion groups, I meet people with very different backgrounds. And, I have to confess, the first time I did one of these, it was hard. It was really hard to try to express myself in a way that was, respectful, but, disagreeing and trying to draw them along and trying to listen to what they were saying and, find points of agreement when I could. So this is not something that's going to happen quickly, right? It's going to happen very slowly. So I think the road back is a long one, because it starts at this very, very basic level of trying to reconstitute some sort of common civic discourse and ties between citizens.
Mhm. Yeah, I think Levine would argue the same thing. It wasn't just institutions per se, but it was also the dialogue around them, trying to make sure they were not just one constituency per institution, but actually the way it used to be when you have people from all stripes go to maybe the same. You mentioned a bowling league, but it could be even just other kinds of events, town greens, or movies. We see different movies now. We watch different TV shows. We buy different kinds of cars.
Totally
So
social, right?
so
Some sort of
separate in
just
so many
social activity.
ways, and are there ways we can find to overcome some of those distinctions? And
Yeah.
you can think about who buys a Prius. Well, what party they're probably going to be in. You can just determine so much by what we buy as to who we are and what our values are. And so again, what is the way there? What are the ways in which we can try to overcome these differences? And it's a huge, huge problem, as you're very well aware. And no one solution is going to be it's going to do it all for us.
I agree.
So somebody else asked the question. Let me just pull it up here. In our society, has the Greek practice of ostracism of the too powerful, the too wealthy, been transformed to the establishment of white-collar prisons? So
I'm not sure. Ask me the question again. I'm not sure I get that.
So in our society, has the Greek practice of ostracism of the too powerful, the too wealthy, been transformed to the establishment of white-collar prisons? Now, I'm not sure if this person is assuming that they're actually not guilty of crimes. They're being sent there because they're wealthy, or
could we put the wealthy behind bars? I guess is sort of the question.
Or maybe, or are we doing that? I think is the question.
Well, to take the question seriously, right? Refocusing police investigations and the judicial system on white collar crimes, as opposed to the low hanging fruit of the guy on the street that's selling cigarettes, right, would be good, right? Because it would, not because it's good to put any one group of people in jail, but because it would equalize the burden of law enforcement across society and make people feel equal. The real problem with the way that crimes are enforced, broadly speaking today, right, not everywhere, not all the time, but broadly speaking, is that they treat people unequally. And again, sort of a fundamental assumption of a good democratic society, a necessary assumption of a good democratic society, is that people are equal and should be treated equally. So you have institutions that don't do that or fail to do that and do that badly or egregiously wrong, then you have a real problem. It makes people, like you were saying, makes people disenchanted with the public sphere. It makes them cynical. And not only the people who are being oppressed, but the wealthy people who are getting away with that, they're cynical as well.
Mm-hmm. So we're kind of winding down here. Let me ask you another question about your other work. So you mentioned in your bio, you mentioned that you're working on democracy and Athenian comedy. So can you just tell us what, so what are you working on and what's the idea behind your work, and what are you hoping to find or already finding in connections between those two things?
If the audience, people in the audience have never read the plays of Aristophanes, you are in for a treat, right? Because we have a huge number, relatively speaking, of plays from this really quite marvelous comedian from the 5th to the 4th century. And unlike the tragedies, you probably read tragedies like the Oedipus Rex or the Antigone, that are set in spaces other than Athens, often in Thebes, some other place that mirrors Athens in terms of its concerns, but it's distant. Aristophanes' comedies are almost all set in Athens itself, right? So it's dealing with the rough and tumble of democratic politics, and it's often critiquing specific democratic figures. Some of the plays can be a little bit tricky to figure out because they require kind of an intimate knowledge of the characters that Aristophanes is lampooning. But here in Aristophanes, you have a lot of kind of more real world democratic activities being held up for critique and sometimes also defended in a way that's comprehensible to the citizen body, right? So this makes them intensely interesting as products of what real Democrats thought on the street, right? Because, if you tell a joke, you make certain assumptions about what your audience thinks is funny. So you can read this in Aristophanes. He tells a joke, so he thinks that audience members are going to think this is funny. So we can kind of attribute that view, at least partially, right, to Athenian Democrats. We don't get this view of the average person on the street very much in Athens, but in these plays, I think we can see it. And they're funny, but they also deal with serious issues of taxation, issues of distribution of burdens. There's a marvelous spoof about kind of radical conceptions of equality. And one of his plays is called, usually translated as the Assembly Women, Ecclesiazusai. The Athenian women get together and they take over the assembly and they communize all the goods of the city, including sex, right? Sex is unequally distributed, as it turns out. You all probably know this, right? So Aristophanes has the main character, Praxagoras, say, you know what, if you're young and beautiful and you want to have sex with another young and beautiful woman or person, first you have to have sex with an old and ugly person. And it leads to kind of predictable comic results, tinged a little bit with misogyny, but, right, this is a critique of a radical form of egalitarianism that is on the edge of what's possible in Athens, right? So they're dealing with these kind of high-level philosophical arguments in concrete ways. So I find that very interesting, right, as a kind of a window into how we can view democracy in Athens apart from Plato, apart from Aristotle, apart from Xenophon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. So I always steal a little bit of Ezra Klein's show when I do these interviews. And he asks at the end of each interview he does for his guests to give him 3 different books that he thinks or she thinks that the audience members should read to learn more about what the person was talking about, whether it be, about politics in San Francisco or whatever the topic may be. So I've been asking our guests to name one book that you'd recommend that our audience members read to learn more about, in this case, ancient Greece and democracy.
Well, can I give you 2, right? To kind of reflect
You
both
can give me 2. That's fine.
Right. So for the ancient Greek side of the argument, there is an excellent book. It's a little dated now. It came out a little while ago, but it's really foundational in kind of trying to figure out how Athenian democracy worked. And it's by a guy named Josiah Ober, and it's called Mass and Elite in Democratic Athens. It's an academic book, but it's not super difficult to read. And this is a really good window into looking at how the masses, how the poor people, how the middle-class people constrained the wealthy in Athens. In most of the major civic spheres. So this was really important to me when I was first kind of thinking about this. The other book I'd say, kind of for more modern things, if you're thinking about, how to do this today, I'm actually reading Helene Landemore's book right now, Open Democracy. Got it on my desk. I'm almost finished with it.
I've seen that book. I haven't read it. I've seen it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an excellent exposition of how to kind of realize mini publics and shift democracy in the direction of autocratic sort of ideas. So Helene Landemore was deeply involved in the French climate summit where they had a mini public. She's been involved in the Parisian city mini public, and she's gone around the world and studied a lot of these on the ground. So in terms of the granular details of how things work, but also how you can kind of package it theoretically to make it acceptable within the confines of liberalism, she's really good on that. So I would recommend that book. It's Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century is what it's called.
Great. Thank you. So Jeff, thanks again for joining us tonight. It's been great talking to you and learning more about ancient Athens and how democracy maybe should work or could work and our political imagination. I also want to again thank the Mark Twain Library and the Grand League of Women Voters for their sponsoring, putting together this program. Now I want to hand the mic back to Aaron.
Yeah. On behalf of all of our sponsors and supporters who made tonight's program possible, We extend our deepest thanks to Dr. Jeff Miller and Dr. Dan for joining us this evening. It is with gratitude that we thank the staff and volunteers of the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library for making this production possible. This evening's conversation will be just as enlightening in rerun, so don't forget to spread the word about the library's YouTube channel. And of course, thanks to all who joined us here this evening. Good night.